David Clendon.
Speaker. I think it's fair to say this Industry Training and Apprenticeships Amendment Bill has come to the House not a moment too soon. The primary legislation that it seeks to amend dates back to 1989, 92, the year 2000, and the point has been made by Labor colleagues that it was blindingly obvious a number of years ago that we were looking down the barrel of a serious skills shortage, a trades shortage in this country. And it has taken rather a long time for this endeavour to improve that situation to come to the fore. Having said that, we do see that it is timely to take a fresh look, and to the extent that this bill endeavours to do that, we are able to support this legislation, albeit with a few reservations. We're particularly interested in the select committee process, as indeed we always are with new legislation, but we think that there are a number of key stakeholders in this who will have interests and opinions and positions to offer that almost certainly will enable us to make this adequate piece of legislation a better piece of legislation as we go through the process. I think part of our problem has been over recent years, and it might be heretical from someone who's both studied and taught in a university situation, that I think we've perhaps oversold the value of university education in recent times at the expense of advocating for trades and vocational training. And I think we need to reverse that and to give our young people a much broader and deeper picture of the value not only of university education, but I think we do need to look very hard at the messages that young people in particular are receiving about the value and importance of trades and vocational trading more generally. So the bill prescribes a number of functions and responsibilities to various agencies, including the Minister, the Minister's Office, Tertiary TEC, the NZQA, the ITOs themselves, both those currently existing and any that might be appointed or rather accredited in the future. I think it's possible to feel some unease at how quickly the various provisions, particularly those provisions that prescribe certain processes in this legislation, could very easily degenerate into a sort of a tick box mentality where as long as people jump through the correct hoops in the right order, then all will be deemed to be okay. And I think we need to be, I'm thinking in terms of things like the criteria for accreditation, the quality assurance requirements, the measuring of the capability and capacity of the ITOs to fulfil their functions and their roles. These are all important considerations, but my experience in the tertiary sector and elsewhere leads me to have some concern that these things very quickly become bureaucratised. They simply become little hurdles to jump over on the way, and they lose their value and their richness and their quality. But I would hope there'd be sufficient goodwill to ensure that there's a very robust and a very transparent and an ongoing engagement between the key stakeholders. And obviously they will be the regulatory authorities, the government agencies, the ITOs themselves, the providers of education and training, and not forgetting, of course, the apprentices and the trainees who will enter into the various programs that will emerge from this legislation and under the conditions that it prescribes. I think it's important that that we do have a genuine and ongoing dialogue within and between those groups to ensure that we achieve the right balance. We want to make sure that influence and responsibility for the ongoing delivery of industry and vocational training sheets home to the appropriate level and in the appropriate time and place, so that we do genuinely, that we can look with some confidence to a system, to a model that will produce the trainees we want, the tradespeople rather, that we want and need going into the future. The point's already been made, but I think it's worth repeating. We are desperately short of tradespeople in New Zealand, right across all of the trades, I think. Construction tends to get the spotlight, if you like, for very obvious reasons. But equally in engineering and elsewhere, we are short of people. something as simple as motor mechanics, electronics, electrical trades. We're short of skilled people in all of these, to the point that we are importing people, we're importing tradespeople, while also sitting on historically high levels of youth unemployment. And there's an obvious disjunct there. And one would hope that some of the provisions of this bill might offer some way to resolve that. I think a point that's often overlooked too is that historically the public sector, the much maligned public service, contributed a regular and reliable supply of tradespeople into the private economy as well as into the public. We had the railway workshops, the post office as it was then, the defence forces provided us with fitters and turners, with welders, with diesel mechanics, with airframe fitters, with pilots, with boat builders. And if you look at the New Zealand super yacht industry, you'll find an awful lot of people there who trained in the Navy. And I think that's something we've thrown out. One of the babies we've thrown out with the bathwater in terms of driving down the capacity of the public service, is we have lost that important supply of trades, and now it's coming back onto the education providers, onto industry, to try and plug that gap that has emerged over time. Again, the point has been made that the legislation requires ITOs in the future to have particular regards to the needs of Māori and other population groups. And of course that begs the question of who's been talked about here. We can look to the education strategy that focuses particularly on Māori and Pacifica, as does this bill, and it talks about youth to some extent. But I think that's a little bit lazy. I think we need to drill in a bit more and perhaps even highlight who are the priority groups we're talking about. I think we need to identify them, and Carol Beaumont has offered one compelling suggestion, that women need to be included in that. But I do think that the overall strategy will be weakened if we don't think a bit harder and a bit more seriously and with a bit more detail about who are we talking about in terms of priority groups and what are the primary needs. Clearly, I think it's obvious that young people in the regions, in the provincial areas, who could very well miss out on some of this if they haven't got ready access to one of the key providers, should be treated as a priority group. And I do think we need to be a little bit more definitive in terms of who we're talking about there. So the bill makes it clear that ITOs may not own or be beneficial owners of registered PTEs, and I think that's a good provision. The ITOs themselves may have an opinion on that, and it'll be interesting to hear from them if they have any major concerns with that. But on the face of it, it seems an obvious division to make, that ITOs ought not to be directly involved in ownership or be beneficiaries of a provider, a private provider. So under the new bill, there are also, I mentioned earlier, the quality assurance improvement provisions in this legislation. One of those will allow NZQA to impose some compliance measures in the face of poor educational outcomes. And again, I think we need to be a bit careful about some of that language, because yes, there's an obvious level if trainees, apprentices are failing to complete, if the skills are not coming through, there are some obvious failures that can occur in any training or educative program. But around the margins, we've seen recently, for example, an attempt to use very crude numbers about completion of courses as indicators of failure of the institutions providing those courses. And that's a very crude and unsatisfactory measure. And I would hope that we would not resort to such inadequate measures when we're measuring educational outcomes. They need to be much more textured, much more layered, much more sophisticated than that. And it's one example where we do have to make sure we don't simply resort to the lowest common denominator in terms of filling in the blanks that legislation inevitably prescribes. I think my final comment would be, and I'll no doubt return to this point again in the future, the question of ITOs being obliged to offer appropriate pastoral care and support for apprentices having regard to age and experience. That's actually not a trivial matter for ITOs to undertake, to accept that responsibility. Obviously, a mature person, somebody going into a second career, an older person may, in fact most certainly would, require less pastoral care, but what is an appropriate level of pastoral care for young people who might be coming from a provincial or a regional environment, coming to a city to study? At what point is enough too much or not enough? I look forward to the ongoing debate around this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Colin King.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's